are welcome to attend the sessions, and this is one of them. And now I'm going to introduce you to our speaker, Christa Kuljian. She is a historian of science, science writer, and the author of 2 previous books, Sanctuary and Darwin's Hunch, Science, Race, and the Search for Human Origins. And Darwin's Hunch, you can see actually it on display, was shortlisted for the Sunday Times Alan Paton Award for Nonfiction. Originally from the Boston area, Christa has lived in Johannesburg, South Africa for over 30 years. Actually, I don't blame her, or I have to tell you that last year I was there, I gave a talk and we had the exhibition, and it's absolutely incredible university with, and I can imagine why you didn't want to come back to the United States and you stayed there. But it's probably other reasons too, right? So Christa is a research associate at the Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research. In addition to her undergrad degree in the history of science from Harvard, she holds a master's in public affairs from Princeton and an MA in writing from the University of University of Wits. Right? It's your stage. You're welcome, Christa.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you so much, Mila. Thank you for having me. Thank you to everyone for coming this afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. It's my first time at Cold Spring Harbor, so it's really quite a thrill for me. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I happened to come to write this book, Our Science Ourselves. Some of you may be familiar with the sort of iconic women's health book, Our Bodies Ourselves. Have any of you known that book? A few, okay. So I had a copy of the book in the 70s. It was produced by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective. So Our Science Ourselves, the title, is really a nod to our bodies ourselves, to the 1970s, to the Boston area, to the women's movement. And along with Our Bodies Ourselves, another influence that inspired this book for me was studying biology with Ruth Hubbard at Harvard. I was a history of science student. But I took biology and women's issues that she offered. And so one of the books in our curriculum was Women Look at Biology Looking at Women. And it was really her work that started me thinking about how science had portrayed women's biology. So, and fast forward, yet another influence or step on my path to writing this book was having published a book previously on the history of science focused on South Africa. Darwin's Hunch is focused on the history of paleoanthropology and genetics in South Africa. So I really had immersed myself in the archives there with that project. And so when I turned to think, what is my next book on the history of science, I decided to go back to Ruth Hubbard and her course. And miraculously, I had my course notes and the course curriculum, and decided to look again at what were women scientists in Ruth Hubbard's network. What were they thinking about and writing about? And the women's movement had definitely had an impact. So there were a growing number of feminist scientists writing in new ways about their science. So I discovered a network of women scientists, and I ended up focusing on the life stories of 7 women, the life histories of 7 women. The first 3 were sort of an older generation. Ruth Hubbard is on the top left. She was a biologist at Harvard in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and she focused on the biology and the workings of the eye, the biochemistry of vision and the proteins in the eye. She was originally from Vienna. None of these 7 women were originally from Boston. So people say, well, why were you writing about women scientists in Boston? And it was really, I think all 7 of them had been attracted to the Boston area to take a job in a lab at a particular university, to network with other scientists. So that was the case with Ruth Hubbard, and also Rita Arditi on the top right. She originally was from Argentina. She did her PhD in Italy in genetics, and ended up in Boston working at Brandeis University and then Harvard Medical School. We'll come back to all 7, but this is just to give you a brief introduction. On the bottom is Evelyn Fox Keller. All 3 of these women have spent time at Cold Spring Harbor, so we will touch on that. And then the younger generation, these 3 women who were influenced by Ruth Hubbard, Evelyn Fox Keller, and Rita Arditi, is Anne Fausto Sterling in the top left, was a developmental biologist based at Brown University. Evelyn Hammonds on the right studied physics at Spelman and Georgia Tech and MIT. And Banu Subramaniam from India did her PhD at Duke, but then spent many years at the University of Massachusetts and is now at Wellesley. So the process of research was so interesting to see how the earlier generation inspired a younger generation. And also the 7th scientist is Nancy Hopkins, who many of you may know well. Spent a lot of time here at Cold Spring Harbor as well. And she was a microbiologist at MIT. And while she was very hesitant to have anything to do with any kind of feminist analysis in the 70s and 80s, in the 90s, she started to face discrimination herself, and brought together, as I'm sure many of you know, a group of 17 women scientists who put together the 1999 MIT report on women in science, which had a major impact. So she, in a way, helps to illustrate a theme in the book, which is that, there's the effort to try to encourage and support women in science, but there was also a lot of writing and thinking going on about women's analysis and critique of their different disciplines in science, and also a more feminist analysis of science. And those 2 things didn't always mesh. So there were a lot of women scientists who were wary of some of this other work. But let's start with Ruth Hubbard. I just want to start with a short reading. And again, this is a younger Ruth Hubbard. On the right is a photo of her with her husband, George Wald. Ruth Hubbard worked in Wald's lab in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s. They got married in 1958. Ruth Hubbard had published extensively in scientific journals, making major contributions around vision. And just to give you a little window on what her experience was like in the late 60s, after more than 25 years of her work. This is just one excerpt. On a crisp morning in October 1967, the phone rang at Hubbard and Wald's house on Lakeview Avenue in Cambridge. It was for Wald, and when he hung up, he said, "I've won the Nobel Prize." For a moment, the couple was in disbelief. They hadn't been working toward it or expecting it. Their son Elijah had already left for school, but they shared the news with 6-year-old Debbie. "We're going to see the King of Sweden," Debbie told the Boston Globe reporter who arrived later that day. Wald shared the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine with the Finnish-Swedish scientist Ragnar Granit and Halden Hartline from Rockefeller University in New York. Hubbard was thrilled for him. She rapidly started preparing for the festivities, found some green silk fabric, worked with a local dress designer, went hunting for matching shoes. The whole family flew to Stockholm, and Wald was treated like a film star for a week. The event's brilliantly lighted ballroom felt like a Hollywood set. As Debbie had predicted, the King of Sweden was there, and Elijah sat next to a princess. After dinner, one of the men on the Nobel Committee, the Swedish scientist Hugo Theorell, walked over to where Hubbard was sitting, glamorous in her floor-length off-the-shoulder gown. The champagne was flowing, a quartet was playing. In her elated mood, she thought for a moment he was inviting her to dance. Instead, he said, "You know you were kept out of the prize by the rule of 3. The music stopped. Hubbard stared at Theorell, trying to make sense of what he was saying, but he turned and walked away. Theorell was referring to a rule in Alfred Nobel's will which guides the presentation of Nobel Prizes. The committee cannot give a prize to more than 3 people at once. In other words, the founder did not want the prize money to be divided into portions that were too small. But Hubbard was flabbergasted. Why had he told her this? Did he think she would feel honored that she had been considered for the award at all? Did he think she would be happy to hear she was 4th? The fact was that she wasn't honored or happy. She was bewildered. At the time, she didn't imagine that perhaps she also should have won, or that sexism had been at play. But many years later, when she was looking back at the moment, she saw it as a dreadful incident. No one on the Nobel Committee would ever have said such a thing to a man, she thought. At least some contemporaries were aware of Hubbard's own unheralded role. After the couple returned from Stockholm, they were invited to a potluck dinner party where the talk mainly revolved around the Vietnam War. Standing with her plate, Hubbard was chatting to friends when another person pulled her aside to ask, "Did you win George's Nobel for him?" Hubbard had certainly played a large part in Wald's success, yet after he won the Nobel, her reputation as a scientist changed dramatically. From that point onward, her research was seen as his work. Moreover, her record in the literature started to read differently. Slowly, Hubbard began to sense that all of her own contributions were being erased. Everything she had ever done was being described as Wald's work. 25 years later, Margaret Rossiter, a historian of science, gave this trend a name, the Matilda effect, and used Ruth Hubbard as an example. As Rossiter was able to show, it was common to subsume a woman scientist's work into the accomplishments of a better-known male colleague. 2 years after Wald's Nobel, Hubbard herself was beginning to notice these discrepancies, and in 1969, her attitude about them was about to change. And this is where we meet Rita Arditi. So as I said, Rita from Argentina was based at Brandeis and then Harvard Medical School, was completely immersed in her genetics, felt it was a joy to be in the lab. And she really wasn't thinking too much about some of the issues facing women in science. It was really her concern about the Vietnam War in the mid to late 60s that started her thinking differently about the role of science in militarism and the role of science in society. And so it was through that she then started thinking about women in society, women in science. And it was as a result of that she got together with a group of 12 women to lead a protest. And that was in December of 1969 at the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the AAAS conference, which was in Boston that year in 1969. And Rita, this is a terrible clip from the Boston Herald Traveler, the microfiche. But this is Rita Arditi at that time with her big, thick glasses. And you know, the group of women brought in posters to a special luncheon for women scientists at the AAAS. They were unannounced. They walked in. Most of the women were not interested and actually a little uncomfortable because what they were saying was that they wanted scientists to address the discrimination against women. And they put together a declaration, which is an appendix in the book from 1969. And so not everybody was interested, but there was one person sitting at one of those tables for lunch that took note, and that was Ruth Hubbard. And it turns out that the action that day was one of the first actions of a fledgling organization in the Boston area called Science for the People. So Rita was one of the founders of Science for the People, and at that AAAS conference, they put forward 3 resolutions. So they were starting to look at how science and society relate to one another. The first resolution was to withdraw all scientific research from issues related to Vietnam, to withdraw troops. The second resolution was related to ending the use of science in the oppression of Black people, and specifically mentioning their concern about the Black Panthers at the time. And the third resolution was about ending discrimination against women. And that protest had a ripple effect on the AAAS that started to play out in the early 70s in terms of their inviting women scientists to speak about their experiences, Ruth Hubbard being one of them. So as it turns out, Ruth Hubbard speaks in her papers, in her oral history interviews, which are available at the Schlesinger Library, about how that moment was a turning point for her personally. Because prior to that, she had really not been engaged with this concern. She thought to herself, you know, she was a scientist, she was a woman, she was at Harvard, she was publishing extensively, she was doing well. What was their problem? What was the concern? But after that protest and reading the declaration, she thought, wait a minute, you know, why am I still in a very junior position after 25 years? Why do I not have tenure? So Ruth and Rita eventually met. This is Ruth Hubbard in the lab. In the top left, this is Ruth Hubbard and her family at a anti-Vietnam protest. And this is a photo of Rita Arditi at Cold Spring Harbor in 1970. She made a trip here to speak to one of the genetics symposium and deliver a paper. And she also talked about Science for the People at that gathering, which was quite unusual at the time in 1970. So Ruth and Rita met and started writing about their concerns, their analysis of the history of biology, of their own work, and they found that Science for the People wasn't always interested in these issues, but they brought together a subgroup of women who were, and they put out a special issue in 1974. Also in the mid-70s, E.O. Wilson's Sociobiology was published, and that had a major impact at the time. And a subgroup of Science for the People called the Sociobiology Study Group came together in the mid-70s. And that group was very concerned about biological determinism. They were very concerned about sociobiology being used to basically blame social problems on biology and genetics of the people involved. So that group also had a subgroup of women who were saying this is not only a concern about racism, this is also a concern about sexism. So that seemed to be also a motivator at the time for a growing number of women scientists in the Boston area to start writing about their fields in physics, in chemistry, in biology. And so at the same time, there was another organization in New York that was also concerned about sociobiology, and that was the Genes and Gender Collective. And I, in reading the writings at the time, discovered that a woman named Dorothy Burnham was a member of the collective. She was a biologist who had studied at Brooklyn College in New York City. And she was the head of one of the labs at the Staten Island Hospital in New York. But prior to that, she had been an active member of the civil rights movement. But she had never brought her politics and her science together, similar to Ruth and Rita. But in the 70s, she was concerned about sociobiology and started writing about that. And also she was writing to other women scientists, because a number of other women scientists were writing about the fact that science proclaims, even Darwin proclaimed that women are passive, males are active, women must stay away from higher education, away from science. And Dorothy Burnham made the point that, well, that is the stereotype presented for white women. But that is not the stereotype presented for black women, for enslaved women. So she was writing about how that's a very different set of myths and stereotypes, so that she was calling out to other scientists to draw attention to both. And Ruth Hubbard was in the audience when Dorothy Burnham spoke in 1977, when Burnham was in her early 60s, and was influenced by that, and they started writing together. But I'd like to say that I've had the pleasure of interviewing Dorothy Burnham. She is 109 years old. She lives in Boston. I know one of her daughters, and this is her today. And Dorothy Burnham will turn 110 on Saturday, the 22nd of March. So there's going to be a celebration. But what's interesting is that she has been celebrated many times for her activism, her work in civil rights. But there hasn't been as much attention to her work in science and her career in the sciences. Now we're still in the 1970s, and at the same time, Evelyn Hammond, so I mentioned to you, was studying physics at Spelman and Morehouse, and then Georgia Tech before going to MIT. She was facing some of the stereotypes that Dorothy Burnham had been talking about. She really was told again and again by faculty, by teaching assistants, by other students, that she could not be a black woman and a scientist. She could not be a black woman and a physicist. So she was bumping up against that resistance. And she went to the library to try to read about other women scientists and look for other black women scientists. And she found very little until the librarian, librarians are very important. So until the librarian said, I've got something for you. And she had a report that had come out in January 1976, co-authored by Shirley Malcolm, called The Double Bind, The Price of Being a Minority Woman in Science. And the AAAS had gathered a group of women of color, scientists, to speak about the issues that they were facing. And so Evelyn read that book, that report, in a minute, contacted Shirley Malcolm, who has continued to be a mentor to her for the last 50 years. Shirley Malcolm has continued to work for the AAAS ever since, working on these issues. So she encouraged Evelyn Hammonds to apply to MIT. She got accepted with a scholarship. So you see how these different networks of women were starting to connect and build in the 1970s. So when Evelyn Hammonds arrived at MIT in Boston, there was another organization that had developed and had been started in the mid-70s called the Combahee River Collective. And they had put together a statement which also was concerned about biological determinism. They were concerned about trying to create space for black women in the women's movement. And you might not think that a social movement in this way would relate to science. But for Evelyn Hammonds, it did, because it gave her the ability to say that she was black, she was a woman, and she was a scientist, and that all three were together in her. They were indivisible. You couldn't, break them apart into different pieces. So Beverly Smith, on the right top-hand side, was working in public health at the time, and she too was supportive of Evelyn Hammonds. And so a full decade before the concept of intersectionality sort of entered the academy in the late 80s with Kimberly Crenshaw, the Combahee River Collective was talking about some of these same issues. Right, so we move into the 1980s, and another networking opportunity that happened then, in 84, 85, was a seminar at Wellesley College. And so some of our, players that we've gotten to know in the book so far attended the seminar on women and science. Evelyn Hammonds was there. Evelyn Fox Keller was there. So she had started writing about gender and science. Unlike Ruth and Rita, she was not only interested in the way that science portrayed gender, but she was interested in what she called the gender of science, how science was always described as masculine. And she thought, well, that's not very scientific. But she also then went on, as I'm sure many of you know, to write a biography of Barbara McClintock, who for many years was based here at Cold Spring Harbor. She wrote A Feeling for the Organism. So she was at this Wellesley seminar, as was Anne Fausto Sterling and many others. And it served as an important place where people started to build relationships. And so when one person got, invited to speak at a panel, they'd invite the other one to feel like they were less alone, less isolated in their science, because they often were the only women scientists in their department. Anne Fausto Sterling turned to Ruth Hubbard to explore the possibility of writing about different ways in which research was presenting stereotypes about women's biology. And so I want to read a short excerpt about this as well. Just a moment. Fausto Sterling wanted to write a book that would explore how myths about biological sex differences had made their way into scientific thinking about biology. She knew she was well placed as a trained scientist to examine these preconceptions, but she didn't want to jump into a project that someone else might already be doing. So she decided to consult with Ruth Hubbard. Hubbard was very receptive to Fausto Sterling's proposal. "We need your voice," she said. "We need as many voices as we can get." It was an important moment for Fausto Sterling. Finally, she had found a way to combine her scientific skills with her work as a feminist. Other conversations were also influential, though not always comfortable. One day, for instance, Fausto Sterling had lunch with a senior colleague in the Brown History Department. He was interested in the new academic work in women's studies, but couldn't figure out how it could relate to science. With sincere curiosity, he asked, "Don't you have to admit that until Marie Curie, there had been no great women scientists? No women of genius?" She looked at him, stunned and uncharacteristically silenced. Every bone in her body felt that his assumption was wrong, but she had no way to prove it. Margaret Rossiter, the historian of science, had not yet published her iconic research, and there was little literature available. Nonetheless, right after lunch, Fausto Sterling started her own search. Every time she came across an article with a title such as "5 Great Women Mathematicians" or "Ancient Woman Chemist," she copied the piece and put it into a box. As the years passed, the pile of articles grew and grew, but her colleague's question still niggled. Then she came across an article titled "The Secret Life of Beatrix Potter" in the journal Natural History. It turns out that in the late 19th century, well before Potter wrote The Tale of Peter Rabbit, she had been a natural scientist. In her research of lichens, she became the first person in England to observe and describe the symbiotic relationship between algae and fungus, traveling throughout the British Isles to classify fungi and making detailed drawings to identify types. Then, after she submitted her groundbreaking paper on lichens to the Linnaean Society of London, she received word that she could not share her findings there because women were not permitted at society meetings. In the end, her uncle read the paper. But Potter, frustrated by the barriers to women, including lack of access to the British Museum, abandoned science and turned to writing children's books. So this story is just one example. There were many, many women in the sciences, hundreds over the past hundreds of years, but many of them were erased from the history books. The story flicked a switch in Fausto Sterling's head. The Potter story was a tale of erasure. Who else had become invisible? How many other women's work had been lost from view? Never again would Fausto Sterling be silenced by a question about the lack of women in science. Her epiphany led to her growing interest in the history of science, a fascination she shared with Evelyn Hammonds during their conversations at Wellesley. And a growing number of courses began to be taught, building on courses that Rita Arditi taught in the 70s. She taught a course at Boston College called Objecting to Objectivity. and of course Ruth Hubbard's course that I was a part of. Anne Fausto Sterling started drawing on some of the new literature, both about women in science, women scientists, and also about African American scientists as well, including the life of Ernest Everett Just. So at this time in the mid-'80s, this is when Banu Subramaniam comes into the picture. She arrives from India in the US and does her PhD at Duke. And she too is influenced by Ruth Hubbard and Rita Arditi and Evelyn Fox Keller and Evelyn Hammonds, and finds actually that starting to take some courses in women's studies allowed her to kind of remain grounded in her science. She was very interested in looking at how with some of this growing awareness having an impact on the actual doing of science. And this was the case in many different fields. At the risk of reading too many pieces, I'm going to read one more short piece to illustrate how the actual putting together of research questions, research methodology, the doing of science was being questioned as well. And this story relates to the picture on the top left about reproductive biology. In 1991, Emily Martin, a young anthropologist at Johns Hopkins University, published The Egg and the Sperm. Martin recognized that both popular and scientific accounts of reproductive biology relied on stereotypes of the male as active and the female as passive. Martin was inspired by Ruth Hubbard. Martin's writings analyzed how scientists and the public use harmful metaphors to describe reproduction, for instance, comparisons to economic production and factories. Sperm was repeatedly presented in the textbooks as production, whereas female eggs were treated as overstocked inventory. In her writings, Martin repeatedly pointed out that scientific language can affect how scientists view what they are observing. In these texts, the egg was commonly described as large and passive. It did not move or journey, but it was transported, swept, or drifted along. In contrast, the sperm was streamlined and active. It delivered its genes to the egg by means of a strong tail and great velocity. As Martin explained, scientists at Johns Hopkins who were working to develop a spermicide contraceptive had found to their great surprise that the movement of sperm is extremely weak and that it mostly moves sideways, back and forth. The surface of the egg is what catches the sperm and holds onto it. The two stick together because of adhesive molecules on both surfaces. Nonetheless, in their papers, the researchers continued to treat the egg as the passive partner and the sperm as the active one. It took the scientists years after first describing their findings to begin to acknowledge the egg's more active role. And this played out in a number of other fields as well, in terms of a number of cell biologists looking at some of the dynamics of how different parts of the cell were described in gendered ways and exploring why was that. Same thing in chemistry. I was talking to a chemist at Brown University who said that that slide meant something to him in terms of molecules being described in gendered ways. And how does that affect the scientific questions, the analysis? Also in physics, in terms of the concept of black hole. That's something that Evelyn Hammonds drew on her physics training to write about. So it's at this point that we turn to Nancy Hopkins, who thus far had not been thinking about these issues or thinking about bias or discrimination. Excuse me. But in the mid-1990s, at MIT, she started to be frustrated because she was not getting the same amount of lab space as her colleagues. And so she got down on her hands and knees with measuring tape to take a closer look at how much space everyone in the department was getting. And as a result, she turned to other women scientists at MIT, and as I said earlier, brought out this MIT report on women in science in 1999. So keep in mind, this is 30 years after Rita Arditi's statement at the AAAS. Now, this report was not the first of its kind, but it had a massive impact. And that is largely because it had the institutional support and the support of MIT's president, Charles Vest, who endorsed the findings of the report. But that did not mean that all institutions, all universities, and university presidents had the same approach. It was less than 5 years later that Larry Summers, in January 2005, made his comments about women in science, and he was pointing to the fact that he believed that one of the reasons why there weren't as many women in science was a biological reason. And he described it as, quote, a different availability of aptitude. So that was 2005. It's 20 years ago. And it turns out that Nancy Hopkins and Shirley Malcolm, the co-author of The Double Bind, they were in the room when he made those remarks. And so they both pushed back against them. And as you know, many of you may know, that occurred worldwide as well. But the book does not end with Larry Summers. It does end in the early 2000s. And both Evelyn Hammonds and Banu Subramaniam were spending more and more time together at conferences, and they wrote together, reflecting on the previous 25 years, looking at feminist critique of science, in the growing area of science studies that have been growing in the 90s, and how the feminist science studies had made a contribution in that growing field. And there certainly were a whole range of people across the country working in that arena. But you know, looking at some of the women from the Boston area. And so really the book, this talk, is in many ways a tribute to the women that we've talked about this afternoon, and recognizing how many of their scientific contributions and their critiques are now part of mainstream knowledge, but just to recognize those contributions and their writing, their research that has had an impact on how we view the world and science and ourselves. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Christa. Also, it's just amazing that we know these people, we met many of them, but actually, if you want to see more pictures of those females, you can come to our archives, right, that Christa used before.
Yes.
And to see it. Do you have questions?
Yes, questions or comments, thoughts?
So I want to ask you, what was one thing that was surprised for you when you met all these women, or when you write about female in science?
Right. Oh, I think there was a lot that was surprising. I mean, I so enjoyed working with the archives, you know, the Cold Spring Harbor Archives online, Schlesinger Library, MIT, Spelman. So it's always so interesting to find correspondence, between scientists. So I love that. And for example, Evelyn Fox Keller and Ruth Hubbard didn't always get along or agree, right? So it's not like all of the women we've talked about were always on exactly the same page, right? There were tensions and different ways of viewing issues. So that was interesting to find. And also to see how things change over time. It was so wonderful to really get to know Nancy Hopkins, as a young woman in the 70s and 80s, right? And then her work in the 90s, and then to meet her in person. I had that experience with many of the women in the book, Evelyn Hammonds as well. And I met Evelyn Fox Keller and interviewed her twice before she passed away. So that has been a thrill for me.
I have another question. So, what is the most important idea you would like readers to take from your book, like you as the author? What is your wish, if I can say this way?
Right. I think one thing is for people to have a growing awareness of women scientists who haven't really been in the limelight. That's one. And two is to also recognize that women scientists, scientists of color today may also be juggling and facing some of the same kinds of challenges, and also to recognize that not everybody is on the same page right from the beginning. So, for example, Ruth Hubbard, she worked in her lab, really didn't think about sort of social dynamics until 30 years into her career. Same thing with Nancy Hopkins. So I think that for maybe a number of scientists who haven't been thinking about the social dynamics, to maybe as a result of reading the book to think, aha, this does relate in some ways to my work in the lab. If it does that, if it encourages conversation around these issues, then I would be, I would be happy for that, and especially given what's going on at the moment. I think perhaps it's safe to say that there is an assault on science at the moment. I would love to hear from all of you about how you feel about that. I think it's very, very possible, and I am very pro-science, even though this book is about critiques of science in different ways. It's definitely a pro-science book. And so I'm very cognizant of the current moment, and was hoping that we might be able to talk a little bit about that. No pressure, but I just hope that Cold Spring Harbor is on solid ground right now.
We are, I think, and I hope that your book, it's like all of them are very, very successful in their careers. So despite suffering on problems, I feel like everyone has in some way, suffer in one way or another, not only in science, in many different disciplines and fields as a female person. But despite all of this, I think that the books about female scientists will bring attention of young females to science, and we'll have more and more people who wish, to come to science because they will think that now the time is different, but on the other hand, they can fight for themselves just to find a space in science. And thank you very much. What would you like to add something?
Yes, I just wanted to add one thing, because I think it's so important to recognize, right, that this, this book is about, I said, a very, high-level scientists at elite institutions. And there are scientists in, a whole set of other institutions across the country, community colleges, other kinds of labs that are at, smaller colleges. And so there's stories there as well. So just right to remind ourselves of that, and you really brought that up. So I just wanted to say thank you for that.
And thank you for a very interesting talk. And I also want to tell you, yes, David.
What made you decide to end the book when you did? I guess it's sort of 2008.
It ended in like around 2003, 4, 5, yeah. And I decided that because as the research was unfolding and the writing was happening, I realized that I was covering, say, about a 30-year period. A 30-year period from, say, around 75 to 2005, and looking at how, the concept of feminist science studies was becoming a discipline. So in a way, I started to see it as, okay, this is also a history of a discipline. And so, but I want to, I want to say, here's some of its origins. I don't want to say everything that's ever been written about it or take it, up to the present, but here's a little bit about its origins. And I thought that felt like a good time to end. I do have an epilogue that brings it up to the present in brief. To say, right, how is all of this playing out? But again, that was up until 2024 or 2023, as I was writing the epilogue. So, but I would say that was how, because I also am interested in narrative. I was interested in that narrative arc, and that seemed like a good place to draw it to a close.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
Yeah,
yes,
anyone?
Please.
This is really interesting. Thank you. I have a question. So these women all had a connection to Boston, all American-based. Have you kind of seen or heard of similar things around the world, and how progress has been different from place to place in the world?
Thank you so much for asking that question, because originally, I live in Johannesburg in South Africa, writing about women in Boston. So initially, I thought that the book would start, in Boston, but then look at similar issues globally or in the South. I was thinking, let me find, maybe there were networks of women scientists internationally that I could bring in, and then it just got too big a project. So I had to decide, okay, I'm gonna keep it to, this piece of the picture, not the whole picture. And I mean, there are books that have been written about all of the, exciting things going on with women scientists in India and Brazil and South Africa. I look forward to doing some more writing about women scientists in South Africa. I know a lot of women in paleoanthropology and genetics, given my previous book, but I look to expand that and write more about that. But there is so much, yes, and so much the flow of information and discussion is not just one way. It's a two-way street. So yeah, there's other books that explore that.
Can you speak up? Or you know what? I have a mic.
I was going to say, okay, I have a comment and a question. The comment is that it was really interesting to learn about science in conjunction with the civil rights movement and the feminist movement, because I feel like I typically think of arts as going along with that, like music and, yeah, physical media. So it was very interesting to learn about how people in my field were making that change and changing the wording of scientific literature to reflect that. And then my question is kind of unrelated, but I was wondering, in the kind of critiques and the calls to action that these women wrote, was it largely about changing like university policies, or more about changing kind of just the social perception of women in science, and what did they see as like the major solution, I guess?
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your comment and your question. And each of these women were writing about different things. So yes, some of them did write about women in the academy. And also Ruth Hubbard, for example, she wrote this essay in the mid-70s, Have Only Women Evolved? Sorry, Have Only Men Evolved? That was the title. And so she went back to look at Darwin, for example, and reread Darwin with this new lens, and critiqued Darwin in a new way. So, but I think that someone like Evelyn Fox Keller, was writing more about the philosophy of science, and so they were, all coming at some of these issues from different perspectives, and writing for different audiences. So, sometimes in a journal like, the Science for the People magazine, and other times for an even, broader general audience. So it really varied. Sometimes, yes, they would put forward, things that they thought needed to be done differently and to change across the board. Thank you.
Do you have more questions? Well, it was really interesting, and also people who cannot come, your colleagues, your friends, we videotaped the talk. We're going to put it on our website, but please just contact the library, and if you cannot see the link, we will send you the link. And thank you again, Christa, coming from far away, and it was a pleasure to have you here.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Okay, thanks.